Hello there and welcome to another live chapter reading for Itsy Bitsy Book Bits. Today I shall be reading from The Singer and Her Song, Empire at Twilight, Book 2 by N.L. Holmes. Chapter 1. What distinguished evening from day was a silence. Uknitum realised as she stirred the watery soup that was meant for dinner. Only as the sun sank, listed into the twilight, did the constant accompaniment of the daytime hours cease. The dull, rhythmic boom of the Assyrian battering ram as it swung again and again against the gate of the city. The noise itself had become a weapon, as relentless as the wind or the killing sun of summer in the desert to the southwest. How did they keep it up hour after hour, day after day? How many men were swinging that ram under the cover of its wood and leather horse? Day after day, on and on they swung it, while the defenders held burning torches down into the contraption in vain. The real question for the people of the little Metenian city of Kahat was how long they could hold out against their besiegers, and in her heart of hearts, Uknitum, daughter of Tapshihuni, knew the answer. Not very long. She would never say it out loud. Everyone was too close to despair. Her family, her neighbours, maybe even the priests who ruled the city and directed its defence. But nobody held out against the Assyrians forever. For nearly 2 months the siege had dragged on, longer than new dogs expected, she thought defiantly, and food was dangerously low. They'd been penned inside before the wheat could be sown. All they'd had for weeks was a little porridge stirred up from the daily allotment, a little dried fruit, a few sheep or goats within the city walls shared out among the inhabitants, then the final bits of dried meat from last winter's slaughter of pigs. Then the dogs. Now they were finishing the stored grain from the temple granaries. She didn't know what would come next. Uknitum refused to eat a rat. So far she had kept her family fed. Little Willu, her youngest son, was delicate despite his thick, stocky build. He wouldn't eat just anything. Her daughter, Tatashi, had the needs of the pregnant. Uknitum had stretched their sparse rations with wild dandelions, roots that grew between the stones, and a few straggly lettuces, already bolted and bitter from the spring garden behind the house. She'd brought her portable brazier inside so she wouldn't have to cook outdoors in the evening chill, and she could keep better watch over Willu, asleep exhausted in his little alcove. They would simply have to live with the smoke. Crouched low over the embers, she stirred a thin soup made with wild greens and a bone she had bartered from the neighbours. She didn't want to know what kind of animal it had come from. An onion would have been worth a king's ransom in Kahat. The fact that they'd been the honoured musicians of the temple of Tesub and Sharuma wouldn't do them much good anymore. No one, not even the gods, had time for elaborate services and long hymns and incense and magnificent sacrifices these days. And what would they sacrifice? Everything edible had been consumed by the god-starving people. Even the priests were manning the walls, organising the making of torches and filling jars of their dwindling water, ready to pour on any fire the Assyrians might lob into the city. She hadn't practised her vocalising for weeks. Who had energy for singing after a long day of hauling rocks? With a shuffle of footsteps at the door and scrape of the wooden bar rising on its lever and string, her husband, Artesub, entered, throwing down his borrowed pickaxe on the floor with a thunk. He was white with dust, face, hair and clothing all the same colour as if he had been hewn from the stone of the walls, a man of stone. Uknitum rushed creaking to greet him and exchanged a kiss, a spoon dripping in her hand. Artesub heaved an enormous sigh of exhaustion and forced a weary smile as he sank down onto the floor mat. He arched his back painfully, leaning against the wall. His dust-stiffened hair stood out all around his head like gorse. Uknitum remembered how Artesub's beauty had struck her when he first came to her father's house. She'd been, 14? And Artesub 9 years older, no longer a child. He'd already proven himself a better lyre player than her father. "Good evening, my dear," Artesub said. "It smells good in here." "Better than it tastes, I dare say. How goes the work on the counter-wall?" Like every able-bodied man in the city, Artesub had been reinforcing the weakening gate, piling stones against the inside of the panels so that when the Assyrians broke through, they would encounter yet another impassable obstacle, if the inhabitants didn't starve first. The women, Uknitum and her daughter included, had spent the day carrying stones from the site of destruction to the slowly rising counterwall. "I was tearing down houses today." He examined his blistered palm and held them up for her to see. Uknitum could scarcely imagine Artesub swinging a pickaxe, but then many things had happened over the last few weeks that she could never have imagined. "We can't seem to round up enough stones." Uknitum laid out a bowl of the pathetic soup. "It won't fill you much," she warned her husband, then called out in a louder voice, "Tatashi, Shella, Come and eat. You never know when it will be your last chance." Tatashi entered from the courtyard where she had been trying to wash clothes with the same jar of water they had used for weeks. She unrolled her sleeves to conceal the red, raw-looking skin of her forearms. Is that water going to get the clothes cleaner or dirtier?" "I don't know, Nera, but they said the wells are low. We need to save every drop for drinking. No chance of going down to the river to do the wash, that's for sure. If it doesn't rain soon to fill up the cisterns, I can't imagine what we'll do. Anyway, this will get out the sweat, if not the stains. I hope you and Atan don't mind sleeping in your tunics tonight. I've washed our nightgowns." The young woman looked down at her father, who smiled at her in return, although his eyebrows were anxious. Her face, tired and dispirited, broke into a smooth smile. "Atani, welcome home. How's the work going?" She took the bowl of soup from her mother and sank to the floor beside him, drawing the low table closer. She nudged her father's shoulder with her own in an affectionate gesture. She's still Papa's girl, Ugnitum thought with a twinge of envy. They've always been so much alike. Ugnitum brought her own bowl and settled herself painfully across from her husband. Squatting to pick up rocks the whole day had put her cranky knee into a bad mood, and the brazier had finished her off. She passed a small pot of water and a towel to Artesub so he could at least wash his hands. The towel was black and stained with blood from the raw fingers that had been wiped upon it, the water none too clean. It too had been reused frequently. "More of the same," Artesub sighed and blew on his soup. His dark lashes were as dust whitened as the rest of him, and gave his black eyes a curiously innocent appearance, like the painted round eyes of a doll. "We could have rebuilt the temple with all those stones, yet the pile still doesn't seem to cover the backside of the gate. I think a 5-year-old could climb right over it." "Well, don't be so negative," Uknitum said. "They haven't broken through yet. By the time they do, you'll have covered the space, and the Hittites may still be coming to our aid. Have they said anything about the priests?" He shook his head, his face shuttered. "The Hittites are coming," Uknitum snorted. "How long have we been telling ourselves that? Our allies are sometimes suzerains, the sworn enemies of Assyria. Of course they're coming, but they never seem to get here, do they? No doubt if they're in Mitanni at all, they're trying to relieve the capital. If Tate fell, Mitanni was no more. The old capital had belonged to the Assyrians for a century. The little bit of the kingdom they called Hanigalbat was all that was left. Anybody but the Mitannians cared." Uknitum found she was more cynical than she wanted to advertise. "If you ask me, this whole rebellion is an absurdity." Tatashi wasn't normally one to weigh in on politics, but like every inhabitant of Kahat, she had a vital reason to be concerned. Her gentle voice was bitter. "They left us alone all this time. Why rock the boat? It's we on the borders who are paying. A little town like Kahat, what can we do? The king wants to look strong and the rest of us pay." "So would you just let them pick us apart?" Uknitum asked. "Of course you had to rebel. We should be part of the Hatti, but those Assyrians think we owe them something. They'll just take until somebody says no to them." Artesub raised his eyebrows in a considering gesture. But his pursed mouth was unconvinced. Ugnitum ploughed on. "I think King Shatura did the right thing. At least if we go down with some pride." "I've already lost my husband in this war for somebody else's pride. Have you forgotten?" Tatashi set her empty bowl on the table with a clatter, surged to her feet and fled the room close to tears. Ugnitum exhaled an exasperated breath through her nostrils, but she rued her harsh words. Tatashi was a soft soul who tended to mix her own emotions into pragmatic things like politics. And she was pregnant. A woman often was on the edge of tears at such a moment, especially when she confronted the reality of bearing a child without a father to protect it. Gods grant that she could even bring the little one to term. It would be her last chance to give Enamati the heir she had never managed to produce before. How terribly sad that Tatashi found herself expecting during this siege. While she was only 27, she could always remarry if she survived, if any of them survived, and if any men were left after all this. Little Willow, what would happen to him? The sudden image of Assyrians batting down Willow's stumpy body and riding over him leapt before her eyes. God forbid, over my dead body. Artesub was watching her wearily, his face strained, the pouches under his eyes crusted with dust and more visible than usual. He had finished his soup and was rubbing his knuckles. She locked glances with him. "Sweet Shurima, look at what those dogs have done to your servant," she thought, caught between sorrow and outrage. Her husband was one of the great lyre players of the age, and his fingers were swollen and abraded from handling stones, his nails ripped off to the quick. He couldn't pluck a string if he had to. This cries out for justice, Lord. Punish those barbarians who have no respect for your temple. Her anger spilled over, and she said more harshly than she intended, Don't leave any food. We hardly have anything left, so you'd better eat it while there is some. Artesub tipped up his bowl to show her it was empty. Thank you, Ashti. I know you're tired too. Yet you and Tatashi always manage to put together something to feed us. Has Willow eaten? He has. He's gone to bed. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Then Artesub's voice dropped, pleading. Ugnitum, my dear, please don't be too hard on Tatashi. She's had a terrible shock seeing her Namatu killed right before her eyes. She has had to bear an extraordinary amount of suffering through all this. Tatashi's handsome young husband had been the first casualty of the siege, shot through the throat with an arrow while everyone stood around below the walls, handing up weapons. Proud and triumphant, Enamati had stood upon the ramparts, all red-faced and laughing, and full of a young man's bravado. He cupped his hands to shout an insult. Then his head snapped back, and he plummeted like a stone into the crowd. What were the chances? She could hear the Assyrians cheering and laughing below the walls, the pigs, while Tatashi froze as if she was the one struck mortally, and began to whimper, No, 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 no. The only consolation had been the discovery soon after that she was pregnant. Now Uknitum wondered if even that had become a punishment, one more thing she had to fear losing. At least back then they'd been able to bury their dead decently. These days there was no time for anything but a common grave. I know, my love, but life has to go on. She's not the only one who's lost her man. If everybody just threw up his hands and said, This costs too much, we might as well open the gates and welcome the damned curs in. She smiled vaguely at his lap and murmured, You may be right, my love, which meant he thought she was not right. She felt a flare of resentment that Artesub, who never came out and said he disagreed, even when he did. She'd berated him about it. Are you ashamed of your position? Then defend it, man. Show some spirit. He was a soft soul like his daughter, always evading confrontation, always making accommodations and never taking a stand. Perhaps that was another lesson learnt from Tapshihuni. The master had brutalised him, yelled at him, and made him do passages over and over, once actually knocking the life from his hand in public. He criticised his table manners, his choice of clothes, and even his mountain accent. And Artesub never fought back. But, she reminded herself, he was the love of my life. She'd been swept away by his beauty, his liquid black eyes, the sensitive face, and those hands which seemed to have a life of their own. And seeing him here, a weary, half-starved, greying man who could be a grandfather, with his beautiful musician's hands tattered and raw, the enormity of their situation overwhelmed her. She leaned over to kiss the bare crown of his head and sighed. What's going to happen to us? There was a moment of grim silence, then Artesub, his face suddenly stiff, opened his mouth to reply. He spoke as if he wished he might not speak the words, struggling through his lips in reluctant pieces. There was a rider who got into the city at sundown at Knitton. They let him into the postern gate. He was coming from Tate. What news of the capital? Have the Hittites come? Yes, they were there, but, Knitton, my love, Tate has fallen. Knitton froze, an icy breath of fear rising the hairs on her neck. This was the end of them. I hope you enjoyed this chapter reading and that you'll go check out the book. Thanks very much for watching. Bye-bye.